Hey guys, tonight we trudge back to the 1700s, a world of polished wooden floors, faint candle smoke, and the soft rustle of silk petticoats as you try not to trip over your own curiosity. Imagine standing in a parlor so quiet you could hear the distant tick-tock of a grandfather clock while someone discreetly judges your every glance. Because back then, marriage wasn't about love at all. You probably won't survive this without feeling a little gratitude for modern dating apps, where swiping left on a dud is considerably safer than navigating a hall full of judgmental relatives. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments while you're at it? It gives a nice sense of global company as we tiptoe through centuries of societal pressure together. Picture this. A young woman, starched in layers of linen and silk, stands in a room filled with her parents, uncles, and perhaps even the occasional nosy neighbor. Across from her, a similarly nervous man adjusts his cravat, trying not to sweat under the weight of expectations far heavier than his powdered wig. This isn't a meet-cute in the garden. This is a business negotiation disguised as courtship. Dowries are calculated, lands appraised, family alliances weighed with the precision of a merchant counting coins. And you, invisible yet very much present, are being invited to witness the delicate tension of a world that viewed romance as reckless, as if the mere flutter of a heart could topple estates and fortunes. Historians still argue whether this obsession with prudent unions genuinely protected families or simply suppressed personal freedom for generations. Meanwhile, the aroma of fresh bread from the kitchen mingles with the faint, slightly cloying scent of beeswax and candle smoke. You might notice a cat weaving around ankles, completely uninterested in matters of inheritance or propriety. Nature's quiet reminder that some things don't change, and yet, in hushed corners, whispered letters exchanged between young lovers hint at defiance. These furtive notes, often hidden in books or behind loose floorboards, are proof that the heart occasionally refused to obey. Fringe historians even speculate that some of these letters contained coded recipes for rebellion, love potions disguised as culinary instructions. In this first slow step through time, you see a world teetering between tradition and the stirrings of personal desire. Clergy's sermons warn against foolish passion, likening uncontrolled affection to fire that devours entire households. Parents nod solemnly, convinced they are guardians of morality and legacy, while teenagers squirm in their stockings, plotting clandestine moments that could be their only taste of agency. And as you imagine yourself standing there, half intruding and half invisible, remember, this is a society where a flushed cheek could spark scandal, yet a ledger balanced correctly could earn everlasting respect. You're learning the ropes gently tonight, like being led down a candlelit corridor, each whisper and rustle offering clues to a world that considered love itself a dangerous gamble. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step forward, quietly observing how marriage in the 1700s functions more like a finely tuned contract than a blossoming romance. Every handshake, every curt nod is laden with the weight of social calculus. You trudge past the polished dining tables and embroidered curtains, imagining the serious discussions that take place over teacups and silver spoons. Families rarely asked, "Do you love each other?" They asked, "Does this union preserve our wealth, reputation, and alliances?" You probably won't survive the shock of just how transactional the whole process was, and yet, somehow, these arrangements held entire communities together. In your mind's eye, you see a sprawling estate, the patriarch seated at a heavy oak desk, quill in hand, tallying property transfers while the young man to be married shifts nervously, trying not to glance at the woman whose future he is about to govern. The girl, for her part, practices a demure smile, knowing that her role is less about desire and more about diplomacy. Historians still argue whether these carefully orchestrated unions genuinely benefited both parties or simply reinforced social hierarchies at the expense of individual happiness. Fringe evidence suggests that some clever young women memorized long lists of family debts and land parcels, quietly arming themselves with knowledge to subtly influence negotiations. Financial considerations dominated everything. Dowries, inheritances, and the exchange of property were meticulously debated, often involving distant relatives and legal advisors who could turn a single poorly worded clause into years of familial conflict. Imagine being present as an anxious young man calculates whether marrying a wealthy merchant's daughter will offset the debts of his ailing uncle, all while pretending to be fascinated by her embroidered handkerchiefs. You notice the faint scent of ink and parchment, the kind that sticks to your fingers as contracts are drawn up with exacting precision. And yet, between the lines of these agreements, tiny acts of rebellion appear. A secret gift left in a teacup, a coded note tucked behind a chair, a fleeting smile shared across the room. The social pressure was suffocating. Brides and grooms were expected to perform their roles with unwavering decorum, often sacrificing personal preference for family expectations. A whispered joke about someone's awkward stance could spread through the town like wildfire, and public shaming was not uncommon. You feel a twinge of empathy for these young souls, whose hearts might have beaten wildly for each other, yet were tethered by duty. And there, amidst the etiquette manuals and candlelit corridors, you can almost hear the soft laughter of historians, still debating how much real choice these couples truly had. The tension between the heart's desire and society's demand is palpable, like walking a tightrope in silk slippers. Even in rural villages where you might expect more leniency, marriages were weighed with a pragmatic eye. Strength, skill, and the ability to maintain a household mattered more than poetic declarations. Farmers hoped for robust children and capable hands, not heart-fluttering romance. And yet folklore and songs hint at the yearning that quietly persisted, a reminder that human nature often defies rules. You notice how small details, a lock of hair saved, a shared glance, become revolutionary gestures, subtle defiance against the rigid world surrounding them. You wander further into the ornate parlours and candlelit hallways of the 1700s, where dowries and negotiations dominate every conversation. The atmosphere smells faintly of beeswax, polished wood, and the ever-present hint of burning tallow candles, cozy in a way that makes the weight of centuries of social expectation almost tangible. Here, a marriage is rarely celebrated for love. It is celebrated for the careful balancing of assets, titles, and influence. You probably won't survive the sheer meticulousness of it all without feeling like every romantic notion you've held is a frivolous luxury, and yet somehow that rigid system was the lifeblood of society. In a bustling merchant home, you see a father pacing behind a large oak table, quill in hand, calculating the precise value of his daughter's dowry. Land deeds are spread before him like a strategic game of chess, each parcel representing alliances, power, and long-term security. You notice a mother hovering nearby, smoothing the daughter's gown while subtly whispering instructions on how to maintain a delicate expression, one that says obedience without betraying intelligence. Fringe historians suggest that some daughters memorize the numbers themselves, quietly learning the language of financial negotiation to sneak tiny victories into these seemingly one-sided arrangements. Historians still argue whether these strategic maneuvers by young women were common survival tactics or simply the exception that proves the rule. Dowries were not just numbers, they were carefully crafted packages of property, livestock, silverware, and sometimes even rare objects like exotic spices or hand-embroidered tapestries. You trudge through the thought of families calculating which assets to include, balancing generosity with strategic restraint. The stakes were so high that even a small miscalculation could provoke scandal or sour relations between entire families. Imagine a young man sweating under the watchful eyes of his future in-laws, trying to appear confident while mentally tallying whether the estate he will gain truly offsets the financial obligations he might inherit. And amidst all this, you glimpse a mischievous glimmer, a hidden note tucked into a drawer, a secret smile shared between two young hearts daring to hope for something more than algebraic affection. Sometimes, Negotiations included extended family members who had their own interests, like distant uncles or cousins who had never met the bride but whose approval could make or break the contract. You feel the tension as quills scratch across parchment, and each signature seals not just a marriage but the careful orchestration of property and power. The young couple may barely speak a word to each other outside of formalities, yet every glance, every bowed head carries meaning that society cannot fully control. Love, when it appears, is often a silent undercurrent, a rebellious whisper against the loud, methodical shuffling of ledgers and legal documents. Even in these highly structured scenarios, tiny acts of personal choice manage to sneak through. A young woman might insist on keeping a personal trinket, a lock of hair, or a favoured book, small symbols of individuality in a world where her value was quantified in coins and land. You notice how these subtle gestures echo through time, reminders that even in the most rigid systems, human desire finds ways to persist. The balance between duty and private longing, between numbers and hearts, defines the peculiar rhythm of these arranged marriages. You now step into the domestic theatre where parents played the role of matchmakers with an intensity that borders on theatrical obsession. Picture a quiet afternoon in a spacious, dimly lit room, the faint scent of lavender wafting from an open window, mixing with the sharp tang of ink from letters and contracts scattered across the table. You probably won't survive the overwhelming sense of surveillance. Every gesture, every pause, every glance is catalogued, analyzed, and interpreted by those whose lives are tethered to the outcome. Here, young men and women are merely instruments, carefully tuned by the hands of their parents to perform in a social symphony that prioritizes alliances over affection. The father, quill poised, reviews a ledger of potential matches. Each candidate is considered not for charm or kindness, but for lineage, financial stability, and the subtle political leverage their family might offer. Across the room, the mother whispers pointed advice: how to maintain an appropriate smile, when to tilt the head just so, how to subtly signal interest or disinterest without disrupting the careful balance of etiquette. Fringe historians suggest that some parents employed clever codes. A handkerchief dropped at precisely the right moment could indicate approval, while a fan held at a particular angle might discreetly communicate a warning. Historians still argue whether these cryptic rituals were widespread or reserved for elite circles, but their existence reminds you that even in a world dominated by duty, nuance mattered. Children, well, you watch as they become pliant participants in a game older than themselves. They might pretend to admire the grandeur of the estates they are promised, all while secretly dreaming of moonlit walks and whispered conversations forbidden by their station. Some young women secretly practiced curtsies in front of mirrors, honing expressions that would satisfy their parents while concealing flickers of genuine emotion. Young men, equally anxious, rehearsed polite conversation, careful not to stumble over words that might betray interest, or worse, affection. The room is thick with expectation, a tangible pressure that presses down like the velvet drapes hanging heavy against the windows. It's not just immediate parents either. Distant relatives weigh in, often without ever meeting the prospective bride or groom. Uncles, cousins, and even family friends become silent judges, each approving or vetoing aspects of the match with a glance, a nod, or a meticulously worded letter. The young couple navigates this labyrinth, balancing obedience and subtle rebellion, all under the faint hum of candlelight. You notice the tension between personal desire and familial duty, like walking across a frozen pond that could crack at any wrong step. Despite this orchestration, small acts of personal agency flicker like sparks. A mother might subtly favor one suitor over another, encouraging private conversations that skirt the edges of propriety. A father might quietly test a young man's cleverness, observing how he navigates conversation without directly violating protocol. You can almost hear the soft chuckle of history itself, amused by these tiny rebellions that whisper of a human spirit not fully tamed by etiquette. And as you trudge silently through these shadowed halls, you realize that the parents, despite their strict control, are unwitting participants in the unpredictable dance of love and negotiation, a dance that sometimes tips toward heartbreak, sometimes toward secret triumphs. You trudge deeper into this world, where courtship is a careful chess game and every smile or nod carries unspoken weight. Imagine standing in a sunlit drawing room, the air filled with the faint perfume of roses pressed between pages of letters and the soft creak of floorboards under polished shoes. You probably won't survive the sheer intensity of the surveillance without feeling a little dizzy because every gesture is scrutinized, every tone of voice catalogued like a ledger entry. Love, in this environment, is treated as a potential liability, a reckless deviation from the meticulous order of family strategy. Across the room, a young woman adjusts her lace cuffs, stealing glances at the man she's expected to marry. He fidgets with his powdered wig, trying to appear composed, while his heart insists on beating faster than propriety allows. Fringe historians suggest that some couples would communicate in code using subtle tics, eyebrow raises, or the careful placement of a teacup to indicate feelings otherwise suppressed. Historians still argue whether these small rebellions were merely playful tricks or genuine subversions of parental authority, but either way, they highlight that human emotion refuses to be fully controlled. Financial considerations dominate every move. Dowries are weighed alongside inheritances, land titles, and political alliances, turning the act of courtship into a high-stakes negotiation. Parents pore over letters, checking for references to debts or property, sometimes intercepting secret correspondences in hopes of maintaining total control. You notice how the young couple must navigate these waters with diplomacy, as a single misstep could provoke scandal or ruin a family's standing. Even a minor flirtation, if misinterpreted, could ripple outward like a stone tossed into a still pond, creating waves that no amount of etiquette can calm. Yet despite the rigid structures, human desire persists. You might see a subtle brush of hands while picking up a book, a shared laugh at a seemingly innocuous joke, or a lingering glance across the room. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant, become revolutionary acts in a society that treats love as frivolous or dangerous. Parents, oblivious to these subtle rebellions, continue their meticulous calculations, believing they are safeguarding futures while inadvertently setting the stage for secret romances. In rural settings, the pressures manifest differently but are no less intense. Marriages are evaluated for practical survival. Can this match produce capable children, maintain the farm, or reinforce social ties within the village? And yet, even in these pragmatic unions, poetry and songs whisper of longing, and clandestine meetings under moonlight reveal that human hearts often defy rules. You notice how small acts, a hidden note, a flower left by a window, become silent protests, signaling that love can survive even under the heaviest expectations. It's a delicate balance, and you can sense the tension vibrating in the very air around you. A reminder that even in worlds dominated by duty, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself. You wander into the bustling streets outside the grand estates, where the rhythm of everyday life reminds you that love's recklessness wasn't just confined to the wealthy. The smell of fresh bread mingles with the tang of livestock, and the chatter of villagers carries over the cobblestones like soft music. You probably won't survive the realization that even in these simpler settings, romantic ambition could be considered dangerously impractical. Marriages here were practical matters. A farmer needed a capable partner to manage the household and fields, while alliances among tradesmen could secure livelihoods more than any fluttering heart ever could. Inside a modest cottage, a father counts the meagre savings he's set aside for his daughter's dowry, weighing them against the practical benefits of a prospective son-in-law. Fringe scholars suggest that some young women memorized family debts and assets in secret, preparing subtle negotiations to improve their standing, a quiet rebellion that rarely left the village gossip mill. Historians still argue whether these tactics significantly shifted power dynamics or were merely symbolic gestures of personal agency, but either way, they illustrate the constant tension between duty and desire. Courtship rituals were often ritualistic and highly codified, even among common folk. A man might present a simple woven basket or a carefully baked loaf of bread, each item carrying symbolic meaning. You notice the almost theatrical nature of these gestures, a performance designed to communicate respect, skill, and capability rather than passion. Yet beneath these formalities, tiny sparks of personal choice persist. A lingering touch, a playful exchange, a whispered joke. These moments stand out like bright threads in the muted tapestry of obligation. Parents monitored interactions closely, not for morality alone, but for practicality. Would this partner be reliable? Could they maintain a household? Did they possess the temperament and stamina needed for survival in a harsh and unpredictable world? You can feel the tension as young couples navigate this web of expectations, often learning to hide affection behind a mask of decorum. Some girls secreted small gifts or letters while boys memorized poems to recite only when certain no adult was watching. Even in the most pragmatic marriages, the human heart found ways to assert itself. Folklore is full of stories of runaway lovers, secret rendezvous, and coded messages hidden in everyday objects. You trudge along the muddy village paths, imagining how each small rebellion could ripple outwards, subtly undermining rigid systems. And as you watch a pair of young lovers exchange a fleeting glance over a fence, you understand that even in a world dominated by prudence and practicality, love's reckless streak refused to be fully tamed. The quiet defiance of hearts against societal expectation is a theme that pulses through every era, reminding you that human desire is never entirely constrained by circumstance. You move now to the edge of a stately garden where clipped hedges and marble statues exude the illusion of order, yet beneath the surface, tension simmers like water trapped under ice. You probably won't survive the subtle drama if you allow yourself to notice the minute gestures, a hand brushing a leaf aside, a careful adjustment of a bonnet, a prolonged gaze toward a distant fountain. In the 1700s, these small movements could speak volumes, more daring than any open declaration of affection. Parents patrolled these manicured grounds with an eagle eye, ensuring that every encounter between potential matches adhered to decorum and duty. Inside the grand house, the young couple sits across from each other at a polished table, playing the timeless game of polite conversation. The father hovers nearby, ledger in hand, as the mother offers strategic suggestions under the guise of casual observation. Fringe historians claim that some young women memorized entire family trees and property lines, equipping themselves to influence negotiations subtly, turning what seemed like powerless compliance into a quiet form of empowerment. Historians still argue whether these acts of intellectual preparation genuinely shifted outcomes or were just clever ways to survive within the constraints of rigid social hierarchies. Every aspect of courtship is measured against social standing. Conversations, gestures, even the choice of clothing are scrutinized for signs of intelligence, tact, and temperament. You notice the young man carefully tipping his head, ensuring he maintains eye contact without appearing insolent, while the young woman practices a smile that communicates respect without betraying too much curiosity or amusement. Love, if it exists at all in these moments, is a delicate undercurrent, hidden beneath layers of calculation and expectation. Dowries remain central even in the most picturesque settings. Land deeds, jewelry, livestock, and even rare commodities like imported spices are negotiated with meticulous care. You can almost hear the quiet tension as quills scratch across parchment, families calculating whether the union advances their wealth or preserves social harmony. Even a misstep, a too bold compliment, an accidental brush of hands can threaten not just a single marriage, but entire networks of alliances. You feel the weight of these invisible forces pressing down like the heavy summer air in the enclosed garden. Yet tiny acts of rebellion appear like sparks in the shadows. A secret smile, a subtle nod, the passing of a folded note. These small gestures are revolutionary in a world obsessed with propriety. You notice how the young couple navigates the fine line between duty and desire, rehearsing every word, every action, like actors in a performance that determines the trajectory of their lives. Even as societal expectations dominate, the human heart asserts itself, proving that love, though considered reckless, refuses to be entirely suppressed. And as you step back into the dappled sunlight, you realize that every glance and every subtle act in these gardens carries the potential to ripple far beyond the neatly trimmed hedges. You drift now into the candlelit chambers of wealthier households, where velvet curtains and polished mahogany convey a sense of permanence, and yet the very air is thick with invisible rules. You probably won't survive the endless calculations of propriety and fortune without feeling the weight of every expectation pressing down on the young couples under the watchful eyes of their elders. In the 1700s, marriages arranged for status and security weren't merely family matters. They were public statements, declaring alliances and projecting power, with love considered an unpredictable, reckless force that could destabilize all carefully laid plans. You observe a young woman seated on a chaise, her posture impeccable, hands folded lightly in her lap. Across from her, a young man adjusts his coat, nervously aware that the smallest misstep could be reported back to the patriarchs waiting beyond the door. Fringe historians note that some women subtly tested their suitors with seemingly innocent questions, gauging wit and temperament without revealing their own opinions. Historians still argue whether these private interrogations were widespread or exceptional, but you can't help noticing that even within strict societal boundaries, human ingenuity and curiosity find a way to assert themselves. Dowries dominate the conversation as both families measure every asset, land, livestock, silverware, even imported fabrics. You trudge through the thought that these contracts, while appearing to secure financial stability, often leave the human heart dangling like a leaf in a storm. Parents meticulously tally numbers, weighing risk against potential gain, sometimes overlooking the subtle chemistry building between the prospective bride and groom. You imagine the quiet rebellions, a lingering glance, a suppressed smile, or a hand brushing against another in a moment deemed accidental but deeply intentional. Even daily rituals, meals, walks in the gardens, evening lessons become arenas for subtle negotiation. A young woman might adjust the conversation to reveal her intelligence, or a young man might subtly flaunt his horsemanship or musical skills, all while maintaining an impeccable veneer of propriety. You feel the tension vibrating through these seemingly mundane interactions, as every movement can be read, misread, or weaponized in the complex dance of status and expectation. Yet amid the layers of calculation, the human heart persists. You notice small tokens exchanged in secret, a folded note hidden under a cushion, a favorite flower slipped into a pocket, a song sung softly across a courtyard. These gestures are quiet rebellions, asserting that while society may deem love reckless, desire is an unstoppable undercurrent. And as you watch the young couple navigate the intricacies of etiquette and expectation, you realize that even in the most meticulously arranged households, sparks of genuine affection flicker, defying every carefully drawn line of calculation. You now step into the dimly lit corridors of a bustling town, where the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages mixes with the smell of coal fires and freshly baked bread. You probably won't survive the realization that in these streets love is treated not as a spontaneous delight, but as a potential liability, a distraction from survival and social strategy. Even for families less wealthy than the sprawling estates you've wandered through, marriages are calculated transactions, often involving the exchange of property, trade favors, or social leverage, rather than whispers of longing in the moonlight. A young man leans against a doorframe, pretending casual interest while counting the advantages of a match in his mind: dowry size, family connections, trade prospects. A young woman, balancing a basket of goods, casts a cautious glance, aware that each word she speaks could be remembered, reported, or twisted into a narrative that favors the cautious over the reckless. Fringe historians suggest that some villagers would leave subtle coded messages, marks on doorposts or folds in letters, to communicate interest without attracting the disapproval of elders. Historians still argue whether these signals were universal or limited to clever subcultures, but they reveal that even in modest settings, ingenuity finds ways to navigate the rigid social lattice. Dowries in the town are more modest but no less significant. Livestock, barrels of grain, handcrafted tools. Each item represents practical security. You trudge through the thought that every conversation is part of a delicate dance, where appearances must mask intent and affection is carefully tucked behind a facade of compliance. A slip of the tongue, an untimely laugh, a lingering look can shift alliances or trigger gossip that ripples through the village for weeks. You can almost hear the soft hum of societal pressure vibrating through the air like a persistent undertone in a quiet song. Yet, amid this rigor, subtle rebellion flourishes. A shared glance over a market stall, a whispered joke in a corner of the square, or the secret exchange of a handkerchief becomes a quiet proclamation. The heart can't be fully caged by rules or fear. Families continue their meticulous calculations, unaware that the young couple may already be negotiating their own clandestine understanding, a silent pact of curiosity and tentative affection. Even in these practical workaday settings, tiny sparks of romance flicker. You notice the girl brushing flour from her hands as the boy offers to help, the hesitation that is part politeness, part intrigue. Each small action becomes a coded message in the ongoing negotiation between personal desire and societal expectation. And as you trudge past the stone walls of the market, you realize that whether in grand estates or humble cottages, love, though deemed reckless, persists, quietly shaping the world in ways that ledgers, dowries, and parental advice could never predict. You slip now into a candle-lit study lined with shelves of leather-bound books, the smell of aged parchment mingling with the faint scent of beeswax from polished candles. You probably won't survive the subtle irony. Knowledge here is meant to cultivate refinement and intellect, yet it also serves as a cage, teaching young men and women precisely how to behave while suppressing the messy, unpredictable stirrings of the heart. In the 1700s, education for the elite was a tool for social strategy, preparing them to negotiate alliances, manage estates, and navigate the labyrinth of societal expectation, all while discouraging any hint of spontaneous romance. A young woman sits at a writing desk, quill in hand, her movements deliberate and practiced. She copies excerpts from moral treatises, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the window where her intended strolls through the garden, adjusting his cufflinks in a dance of preparation and anticipation. Fringe historians suggest that some young women secretly annotated these texts, highlighting passages about desire, longing, and virtue, effectively creating a private manual on the nuances of clandestine affection. Historians still argue whether such marginalia were commonplace or rare, but they hint at a quiet intellectual rebellion, a way to retain agency within rigid structures. Conversations about propriety dominate the curriculum. Lessons stress modesty, restraint, and measured expression, qualities that parents equate with suitability for marriage. You trudge through the thought that every carefully recited phrase is meant to convey intelligence and decorum. Yet beneath the surface, personal feelings bubble, restrained but insistent. Even in these cultivated spaces, secret communications flourish, folded notes tucked inside books, penciled symbols in margins, or the discreet passing of a flower across a table. Each small act is a rebellion, a tiny declaration that love, however considered reckless, refuses to be extinguished. Dowries and family strategy remain central, even in the hushed quiet of a study. Parents calculate potential gains as young adults practice letters, conversations, and gestures designed to maximize social advantage. Yet despite all the calculation, human curiosity persists. A fleeting laugh at a witty comment, a deliberate touch of a hand when retrieving a book, or the shared excitement over a coded poem can feel revolutionary in a world governed by order. You notice the tension as intellect and desire coexist, each learning to navigate the other. Even in the cloistered calm of libraries and studies, the subtle rebellion of emotion thrives. A soft smile exchanged over a page, a shared glance of recognition, or a secret note slipped between lessons carries significance far beyond its simplicity. As you watch these small dramas unfold in candlelight, you sense that human emotion is never fully governed by etiquette, property, or expectation. Love, though labeled reckless, finds its moments threading through the calculated world like a quiet, persistent melody that refuses to be silenced. You wander next into the flickering glow of a ballroom at twilight, where polished floors gleam like liquid amber under the candlelight, and chandeliers sway ever so slightly as if in tune with your heartbeat. You probably won't survive the subtle theatre of power and performance if you pay close attention. Every bow, every curtsy, every carefully measured laugh is a piece of a social chessboard, with love considered a dangerously unpredictable move. In the 1700s, these formal dances were less about passion and more about appearances, an opportunity for families to display wealth, taste, and influence while discreetly assessing potential matches. A young man glides across the floor, his steps precise, every posture rehearsed to convey confidence without arrogance. Across the room, a young woman adjusts her fan with delicate fingers, eyes scanning the crowd while hiding her curiosity. Fringe historians note that some women developed intricate systems of signaling, tilting a fan, lowering a gaze, or adjusting a glove, to communicate intentions subtly without breaching social etiquette. Historians still argue whether these codes were standardized or improvised, but either way they illustrate the ingenuity with which humans navigated rigid conventions. Music sets the rhythm, a constant undercurrent dictating motion and mood. You trudge through the thought that while waltzes and minuets provide a stage for observation, they also create fleeting private moments. A hand brushing lightly against another, a whispered compliment carried on the wind, a shared laugh barely audible, these acts become tiny rebellions against societal oversight. Families may calculate alliances, dowries, and lineage with meticulous care, yet the human heart manages to interject, subtle and uncontainable. Even attire is a strategic tool. Dresses and coats convey status, taste, and familial wealth, while also allowing small, personal touches. A ribbon in a favored color, an unusual stitch pattern, or a carefully chosen piece of jewelry. You notice how young adults manipulate these symbols to signal intelligence, wit, or personal preference, threading individuality through the fabric of societal expectation. Though dangerous and frowned upon, finds its way into these calculated displays hidden in plain sight. As you move to the balcony overlooking the garden, the sound of laughter and music blends with the chirping of evening crickets, creating a soft, hypnotic rhythm. Tiny moments, a shared glance across the parquet, the subtle brush of fingers during a bow, the exchanged secret smile, reveal that affection persists even amidst choreography, candlelight, and social scrutiny. Even here, where every gesture is a potential negotiation, love, reckless, unpredictable, and beautiful, manages to carve its small but enduring space. You drift now down a narrow, lantern-lit alley behind the grand houses, where the scent of damp cobblestones mixes with the faint aroma of bread and herbs from nearby kitchens. You probably won't survive the quiet intrigue here if you don't notice the subtle negotiations that occur away from the polished ballrooms and manicured gardens. In the 1700s, young lovers often found these hidden corners, the market stalls, back alleys, or churchyards, perfect for brief exchanges, carefully timed to avoid prying eyes. These moments were considered reckless by society, yet they offered the only breathing room for personal feeling amid the strict rules of arranged marriages. A young woman leans against a wall, her shawl pulled tight to conceal her identity. Across from her, a young man shifts nervously from foot to foot, checking the street for approaching figures. Fringe historians suggest that clandestine meetings like these sometimes involved coded objects, a folded handkerchief placed conspicuously, a scratch on a fence post, or a particular arrangement of flowers in a window to signal willingness or interest. Historians still argue whether such signals were widespread or mostly romanticized anecdotes, but their existence hints at a clever subculture of subtle defiance. Dowries and family expectations lurk in every conversation, even in these hidden spaces. A whispered promise of affection may feel liberating, but both participants are acutely aware that discovery could ruin reputations or end prospects entirely. You trudge through the tension like a heavy fog. Each laugh, each pause, each fleeting touch carries risk, yet also exhilaration. The thrill of potential scandal, though perilous, gives these secret encounters an intensity that formal courtships could never match. Even mundane details, footsteps on uneven stones, the rustle of skirts, the flicker of candlelight, become part of the choreography. Every movement must be measured, every word chosen to convey sentiment without overstepping boundaries. You notice the subtle smiles, the playful tilts of the head, the carefully concealed hands brushing accidentally or intentionally. These are tiny acts of rebellion, proving that human emotion cannot be entirely subdued by etiquette or parental oversight. Yet in these shadows, love thrives. A note slipped from hand to hand, a quiet laugh exchanged over a misdelivered basket, or the secret passing of a token keeps the flame alive. Even in the most practical, duty-bound society, young hearts carve small spaces for intimacy, proving that affection, though deemed reckless, persists. And as you step away from the alley into the dim glow of lanterns lining the main street, you sense that these fleeting, hidden moments shape not only individual lives but also the quiet evolution of social norms, whispering that desire, however constrained, cannot be fully extinguished. You now wander into the hushed elegance of a countryside manor at dusk, where the scent of damp earth from the surrounding gardens mingles with the faint sweetness of burning tallow candles. You probably won't survive noticing how even the most serene estates are arenas for subtle negotiation, where love is treated as a curious hazard rather than a natural impulse. In the 1700s, families in these manors measured potential matches with meticulous precision, considering land holdings, political alliances, and reputations as heavily as personality or charm. A young woman sits near a window, gazing at the fading light while holding a small embroidered sampler. Across the room, a young man practices polite conversation, every word and inflection weighed to impress without overstepping. Fringe historians note that some young couples used small, ostensibly innocent domestic tasks like folding laundry or arranging books as a medium for subtle communication, conveying wit or shared understanding without alerting watchful parents. Historians still argue whether these methods were widespread or merely charming anecdotes preserved in letters, but they hint at the ingenious ways love persisted beneath societal oversight. Dowries, once again, dominate the underlying logic. Portions of land, cattle, or rare textiles are discussed and recorded with the precision of accountants. Yet beneath this arithmetic, the heart occasionally asserts itself in tiny gestures, a brush of fingers while passing a tray, a shared smile at an inside joke, a stolen glance across the hearth. You trudge through the reality that even amidst carefully arranged rooms, furniture, and expectations, the human heart finds ways to communicate, often silently but effectively. Even the daily routines, meals, music lessons, walks through manicured gardens, become stages for subtle social play. You notice how the young man might offer a compliment on a needlework pattern or a particularly clever verse in a poetry lesson, while the young woman responds with carefully balanced humor. These interactions, though seemingly mundane, carry significance, a code of engagement where affection and propriety intertwine in a delicate dance. And yet, amid all calculation and performance, tiny rebellions flourish. A letter passed under the table, a playful challenge during a chess game, or a shared secret during a lesson are tokens of defiance against the rigid structures surrounding them. In these quiet, measured moments, love, though socially dangerous and often labelled reckless, persists, threading through the intricacies of wealth, expectation, and propriety, reminding you that the human heart is remarkably inventive and infinitely resilient even in the strictest of social cages. You step into the lively chaos of a local market at mid-morning, where the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, and horse manure mingles in a surprisingly comforting bouquet. You probably won't survive noticing that here, even love, a supposedly private, delicate affair, is subject to scrutiny and negotiation. In the 1700s, these bustling spaces were not only for buying and selling goods, but also for assessing potential spouses. Observant families watched interactions closely. Did the young man assist the merchant's daughter with her basket? Did the young woman laugh at the tailor's jokes too readily? Every gesture, was an unspoken test. A young woman pauses at a stall to examine a bolt of fabric, her hands brushing lightly against another girl's. Nearby, a young man haggles with the baker, but his eyes keep darting toward the same young woman, measuring her reactions with the precision of a surveyor. Fringe historians point out that some courtships were subtly codified through market interactions, selecting certain stalls, handing specific coins, or exchanging reserved phrases that conveyed interest without drawing unwanted attention. Historians still argue whether these small signals were universally recognized or only known within tight-knit communities, but their existence underlines how humans adapt affection to fit within strict social codes. Dowries and family expectations lurk even amidst the noise and barter. A basket of eggs, a carefully weighed sack of flour, or a portion of freshly cured meat can be proxies for wealth, subtly influencing match prospects. You trudge through the realization that even a playful wink during a negotiation could ripple through social circles, interpreted, exaggerated, and reported to cautious parents. Social surveillance is inescapable, yet ingenuity finds a way. An exchanged coin with a tiny mark, a shared word of humor in the bustle, or a fleeting brush of hands becomes a clandestine conversation that might escape notice. Even the sensory overload, the cries of merchants, the clatter of wooden carts, the scent of spices, can create cover for private interactions. A shared laugh over a dropped apple, a moment of mutual teasing at the cheese stall, or a secret nod while passing a basket becomes a microcosm of rebellion, a small assertion of personal feeling in a world dominated by prudence and practicality. By the time you leave the market and follow the sun's path across the cobblestones, it becomes clear that human emotion is tenacious. Love, though labeled reckless by families and society, finds its foothold in subtle glances, whispered jokes, and fleeting touches. In these everyday arenas of commerce and gossip, the heart navigates rules, dodges scrutiny, and continues to shape the lives it touches, proving that even under the heaviest social constraints, desire cannot be fully restrained. You find yourself wandering down a tree-lined lane on the outskirts of a sleepy village, the late afternoon sun casting long, warm shadows across the uneven dirt road. You probably won't survive realizing that even in these seemingly calm spaces, love is treated as a precarious gamble, a whisper of risk in a world that prizes strategy over sentiment. In the 1700s, rural life was tightly structured. Every action, every interaction, every word could ripple through families and neighbors, influencing perceptions and potential alliances. A young woman carries a basket of herbs, her fingers brushing the stems gently as she hums a tune almost too quiet to hear. Nearby, a young man rides a slow horse, adjusting the brim of his hat while trying not to appear too deliberate in his glances. Fringe historians suggest that these country lanes were often the stage for subtle courtship rituals, a flower left at a doorstep, a carefully timed wave, or the recitation of a line from a shared poem could communicate affection without openly defying convention. Historians still argue whether these gestures were widespread or primarily anecdotal, but their presence hints at a persistent, quiet, human ingenuity. Dowries, property arrangements, and parental expectations follow these young lovers even here. A parcel of land or a family cow might weigh heavily in the background of every encounter, reminding you that romance is always intertwined with practicality. You trudge through the awkward tension as both parties navigate proximity, timing, and unspoken rules. An exchanged smile over the fence, a hand brushing accidentally or intentionally against another during chores, becomes a subtle yet potent declaration of interest. Even the simplest sensory details, rustling leaves, distant laughter of children, the scent of freshly tilled soil, become part of the dance. You notice how small, almost accidental touches, a shared basket handle, a brief meeting of eyes through the dappled sunlight, carry meaning far beyond their simplicity. These acts, delicate and fleeting, reveal that affection has a way of threading through everyday life, defying the rigid social expectations that define the era. And yet, despite caution and societal scrutiny, these small gestures persist. A hidden flower tucked behind a gatepost, a secret message written on a scrap of paper, or the quiet enjoyment of shared humour all testify to the resilience of desire. In these gentle country moments, love, though labelled reckless, manages to thrive, proving that even the quietest lanes can be charged with unspoken connection and the enduring tension between duty and the human heart. You meander now into the dim glow of a candlelit study, where the faint smell of parchment and ink mingles with the lingering aroma of a recently extinguished fire. You probably won't survive noticing how even the quietest rooms are arenas for subtle social manoeuvring. In the 1700s, letters were both weapons and lifelines, meticulously composed to balance sincerity with discretion, passion with propriety. A single misphrased line could provoke scandal, yet a carefully chosen word could ignite a clandestine romance that would endure behind closed doors. A young man perches on the edge of a heavy oak chair, quill in hand, hesitating as he considers the phrasing of his letter. Across the room, a young woman folds her own pages, hiding a small smile at the words she has just written. Fringe historians note that some correspondences contained elaborate codes, tiny symbols, coloured threads, or even subtle differences in ink shading could convey additional meaning. Historians still argue whether these codes were widely understood or largely confined to particular literate circles, but they show that human creativity often finds ways to circumvent social restrictions. Dowries and family approval loom in every exchange. Each carefully crafted letter might be intercepted or read aloud by guardians, adding layers of tension to the act of writing. You trudge through the reality that every word is a potential risk. A compliment could be misinterpreted. An expression of longing could invite scrutiny. Yet within these constraints, small rebellions flourish. Inside jokes, references to shared memories, or coded sentiments allow affection to slip through the cracks of propriety. Even the physicality of writing carries meaning. The pressure of the quill, the choice of paper, the subtle folds, all these choices reveal care, thought, and a desire to communicate more than the words themselves. You notice how pauses between sentences or the careful spacing of paragraphs can convey emotion, subtly defying the rigid expectation that correspondence remain purely formal and transactional. By the time you set down your imaginary letter and lean back against the worn leather chair, it becomes clear that love, though deemed reckless, has a remarkable way of embedding itself into daily life. The whispers of affection carried across candlelight, the secret codes hidden in ink, and the fleeting thrill of correspondence all demonstrate that even in the strictest social structures, human hearts remain inventive, persistent, and quietly defiant. You drift into the shaded corridors of a grand estate just as evening begins to settle, where the smell of polished wood mingles with the faint tang of burning peat in the hearths. You probably won't survive noticing how even in these imposing halls, love is treated like a minor rebellion against order, a spark that flares where rules attempt to suffocate it. In the 1700s, young couples navigating these spaces faced a careful choreography, each step measured, each word chosen, every glance a potential scandal or a secret triumph. A young woman lingers by a marble bust, her fingers lightly tracing the curve of its pedestal while pretending to admire its artistry. Across the hall, a young man leans casually against a doorway, his posture deliberate, eyes darting toward her with calculated subtlety. Fringe historians suggest that such small gestures, tapping fingers in rhythm, positioning oneself near certain statues, even lingering over a fireplace, were part of an unspoken language of courtship. Historians still argue whether these rituals were broadly recognized or mostly confined to the upper echelons of society, but their presence underscores the ingenuity of human affection constrained by propriety. Dowries, inheritance, and the watchful gaze of parents hover like unseen shadows, influencing every interaction. You trudge through the tension as both young people navigate the balance between risk and desire. A whispered remark about a shared tutor, a barely noticeable nod toward a prized painting, or a playful tilt of the head can communicate volumes, slipping past the scrutinizing eyes of the chaperones who patrol the hallways with mild suspicion. Even the ambient details, the faint creak of floorboards, the subtle flicker of candlelight, the distant rustle of curtains in the breeze, become part of this delicate dance. You notice the way gestures take on new significance in these hushed spaces. A borrowed book, a shared laugh over a misremembered fact, or a subtle brush of fingertips along the banister carries both warmth and rebellion. By the time you reach the end of the corridor and peer into a drawing room bathed in golden lamplight, it becomes clear that love, though socially labelled reckless, persists through the smallest acts. The careful glances, whispered jokes, and subtle movements within these majestic spaces reveal that human desire, ingenuity, and connection cannot be fully tamed even amidst the grandest architecture and strictest social expectations. You wander into the soft chaos of a bustling ballroom where the polished wooden floor gleams under the warm glow of chandeliers and the faint scent of roses drifts from corner arrangements. You probably won't survive noticing how love, even here, is treated as a calculated risk, a delicate rebellion masked by music and manners. In the 1700s, balls were social battlegrounds, each curtsy, each bow, each exchanged word observed not only by the participants, but by parents, tutors, and ever-watchful onlookers. A young man adjusts his waistcoat nervously, glancing at the young woman waiting near a velvet-curtained window. She sips from a delicate glass of punch, feigning interest in the dancers around her, while keeping a careful eye on him. Fringe historians have noted that dances themselves were often coded. A subtle change in the bow, a slightly longer handhold, or the choice of partner could convey unspoken messages of interest or alliance. Historians still argue whether these codes were standardized or more spontaneous, improvisational signals, but they illustrate how ingenuity can bend social constraints. Dowries, family reputation, and lineage hover over every step of the waltz. You trudge through the tension as young couples balance charm, propriety, and genuine emotion. A fleeting touch of hands, a whispered word over a fan, or a shared laugh at a witty remark might be a scandal to one observer and a carefully masked confession to another. Every gesture carries weight, and the dance floor is as much a proving ground for decorum as it is for subtle courtship. Even the sensory details, the rustle of silk, the faint clink of glasses, the scent of candle wax mingling with perfume, serve as accomplices to these secret exchanges. You notice how small, almost accidental touches, a shared step, a slight brush of fingers along a sleeve, become private declarations in a world dominated by vigilance. The music, the candlelight, the flutter of fans, all work together to create fleeting pockets of privacy where human affection can slip through unnoticed. By the time you watch the final dancers retreat to the edges of the room, it's evident that love, though deemed reckless, thrives in ingenuity and subtlety. The coded steps, careful glances, and stolen touches all demonstrate that even within the grandest spectacles of propriety, the human heart will quietly find its voice, negotiating rules, subverting expectations, and proving that affection is as resilient as it is persistent. You now drift into a quiet library tucked away behind heavy velvet drapes, the faint smell of aged parchment and beeswax filling your senses. You probably won't survive noticing how love, in this room of hushed whispers and polished wood, continues its subtle rebellion against propriety. In the 1700s, libraries weren't just for reading, they were private arenas where intellect, curiosity, and emotional exchange intertwined, often under the cautious supervision of family members or tutors. A young woman slides a book from the shelf, the spine creaking ever so slightly, while her fingers brush against the hand of the young man who reaches for the same volume. Fringe historians point out that such library interactions were sometimes ritualized, offering a particular volume, marking passages with a small ribbon, or sharing marginal notes could all communicate interest without overtly flouting social norms. Historians still argue whether these subtle exchanges were common or merely romanticized in surviving accounts, but their existence reveals the clever ways human connection finds expression. Dowries and familial expectations linger like shadows among the stacks. A careful conversation about a newly acquired book might be scrutinized for subtext. A shared joke, a playful disagreement about an author's interpretation, or a fleeting smile might hint at mutual attraction. You trudge through the realization that even the simple act of borrowing a book could be loaded with significance. An unspoken message in the midst of ink and parchment. Even the sensory details, the soft rustle of pages, the faint scent of glue and leather, the filtered sunlight slanting through tall windows, play their part in these covert interactions. You notice how a shared laugh over a clever passage, a whispered remark about history or poetry, or a hand brushing against another while adjusting a book, creates a quiet intimacy that transcends the rigid social framework. By the time you leave the library, the weight of the collected knowledge and the unspoken gestures leaves you aware that love, though socially labeled reckless, finds inventive channels. Through subtlety, shared intellect, and discreet signals, affection continues to flourish quietly yet persistently, proving that human hearts adapt, endure, and communicate even in the most controlled and watchful environments. You drift into the muted warmth of a candlelit drawing room, the air heavy with the faint aroma of polished wood, burning tallow, and a hint of lilac from the flower arrangements. You probably won't survive noticing that even here, amid genteel conversation and polite laughter, love is considered a dangerous gamble, something to be observed, weighed, and quietly judged. In the 1700s, such parlours were more than spaces for socializing. They were testing grounds where gestures, glances, and carefully chosen words were scrutinized for signs of interest or impropriety. A young woman leans slightly forward, feigning interest in the embroidery she holds, while her eyes occasionally flick toward a young man seated across the room. He pretends to study a book but allows his gaze to wander, timing it just so to catch hers without drawing the attention of the matriarch hovering nearby. Fringe historians have noted that certain subtle signals, a tilted head, a carefully concealed smile, the gentle crossing of legs, could carry immense weight in these social microcosms. Historians still argue whether such behaviors were universally codified or largely improvised, but their presence underscores the ingenuity of human courtship within strict social confines. Dowries, inheritance, and familial reputation hover like invisible spectres over every conversation. A compliment about the quality of needlework, a shared remark about a visiting dignitary, or a gentle laugh at a humorous anecdote might be innocent on the surface, but charged with subtext beneath. You trudge through the realization that each word, each gesture, is a delicate balancing act, signaling interest while avoiding censure, cultivating connection without transgressing propriety. Even the sensory details, the soft rustle of silk dresses, the faint clinking of porcelain teacups, the flicker of candlelight against the gilded mirrors, enhance the subtle dance of courtship. You notice how a fleeting touch while passing a tray of refreshments, a brief overlap of hands while exchanging books, or a shared smothered giggle can become secret affirmations, unnoticed by the wider audience, yet vivid in meaning to the participants. By the time the evening wanes and the guests depart, it becomes clear that love, though labelled reckless, finds ways to flourish within constraint. Through careful observation, subtle signals, and daringly quiet ingenuity, affection persists, threading through conversation, gesture, and glance, proving that even in the most rigidly controlled environments, the human heart will always seek connection, however clandestine or fragile. You wander into the shadowed corridors of a sprawling estate just as the lamps are lit, casting soft pools of golden light along the walls. You probably won't survive noticing how love, in these long, echoing passages, becomes a silent negotiation between desire and decorum. In the 1700s, even the act of walking from one room to another could carry meaning. A shared journey past a tapestry, a near collision at a corner, a polite offer to open a door could all be imbued with subtle signals of interest. A young man adjusts his coat as he moves down the hall, eyes flicking toward a young woman who carries a small bundle of letters. She pauses, pretending to smooth the folds of her dress, though her attention is clearly elsewhere. Fringe historians suggest that these quiet interactions, often overlooked by the supervising matrons, allowed young people to communicate affection without words. Historians still argue whether such chance encounters were orchestrated with cunning or largely improvised, but their existence underscores the resourcefulness of the human heart under strict social constraints. Dowries, inheritance, and family expectations loom like invisible guardians, shaping every movement and glance. A subtle brush of hands while passing a candlestick, a shared laugh over a whispered joke, or the delicate exchange of a note tucked into a pocket could be charged with meaning, risking censure if discovered. You trudge through the tension, aware that every corridor, every turning of a doorknob becomes part of a delicate dance where the stakes are social standing, reputation, and the chance for connection. Even the sensory details, the faint creak of floorboards, the warmth radiating from wall-mounted lamps, the scent of burning tallow mingling with polished wood, add layers to these clandestine exchanges. You notice how small, almost accidental touches, a brush against a sleeve, a near overlap of hands, a shared glance through a shadow, become private affirmations of affection, weaving intimacy into ordinary movement. By the time you reach the grand staircase, it's clear that love, though socially risky, finds expression in subtlety and ingenuity. The quiet gestures, fleeting touches, and shared moments within these echoing halls demonstrate that human connection persists, threading itself through ordinary spaces, defying social boundaries, and proving that even in the most disciplined environments, the heart finds ways to speak softly, yet persistently. You drift into the cool, dimly lit garden courtyard, where the scent of night-blooming jasmine mingles with the earthy aroma of damp soil. You probably won't survive noticing how even outside the rigid walls of the house, love is treated like a game played on a knife's edge. In the 1700s, gardens were more than decorative spaces. They were arenas for secret rendezvous, whispered exchanges, and carefully orchestrated encounters away from watchful eyes. A young woman traces her fingers along the wrought-iron railing of a fountain, pretending to admire the carvings, while her gaze repeatedly seeks out a young man perched on the stone bench. He adjusts his coat, feigning interest in the moonlit water, yet every shift of his posture seems designed to catch her attention. Fringe historians note that these nocturnal meetings often included subtle signals, the placement of a hand on the railing, the timing of a footstep on gravel, or even the choice of a particular flower as a conversational prop. Historians still argue whether such gestures were commonly understood or confined to particular circles of literate elite youth, but they highlight the clever ways affection navigates social restriction. Dowries, reputation, and the looming presence of parents or guardians still shape every moment. You trudge through the tension as the pair navigates paths between rose bushes and statues, aware that even a seemingly innocent glance can carry weight. A shared laugh at a misplaced fountain spray, a brushing of hands while picking up a fallen glove, or a whispered comment about the stars can communicate more than words aloud, threading affection into the night. Even the sensory details, the cool breeze brushing against your skin, the soft murmur of water, the occasional rustle of leaves, intensify the intimacy of these stolen moments. You notice how a careful lean over a marble ledge, a subtle shift to avoid the dew, or a shared pause beneath a trellis becomes part of an unspoken, intricate choreography of courtship. By the time you step back toward the grand house, it's evident that love, though labelled reckless, finds expression in ingenuity and patience. The quiet gestures, whispered exchanges, and small acts of courage within this garden reveal that human hearts, even under rigid social constraints, persistently seek connection, bending circumstances without breaking and finding intimacy in the subtlest of moments. You slip into a narrow passage behind the servants' wing where the scent of baked bread and simmering stew drifts faintly from the kitchens. You probably won't survive noticing how love, even when confined to back corridors and hidden corners, still manages to assert itself with clever subtlety. In the 1700s, these overlooked spaces often became clandestine meeting points, away from prying eyes and the rigid gaze of matrons or tutors. A young man leans casually against the stone wall, pretending to adjust his breeches while peering toward a young woman who is ostensibly fetching a folded letter. Fringe historians have highlighted that these secretive interactions were sometimes ritualized, a lingering glance, the deliberate choice of which stair to ascend first, or even the timing of footsteps could convey hidden intentions. Historians still argue whether these behaviors were widely recognized or mainly romanticized in surviving accounts, yet their existence points to the resourcefulness of affection under constraint. Dowries, inheritance, and social reputation still hover invisibly over each encounter. You trudge through the tension as the pair negotiates proximity, a shared corner by a low window, a whispered remark about a household chore, or a playful nudge of an elbow can carry emotional weight far beyond the casual observer's perception. Even a seemingly mundane exchange, passing a tray, straightening a curtain, or adjusting a candle, becomes a canvas for subtle expression. The sensory details amplify the intimacy, the warm, yeasty scent of bread, the faint echo of boots on stone floors, the hum of a distant fire. You notice how a fleeting brush of hands while retrieving a dropped note, a near collision that results in a shared laugh or a soft whispered word, creates a moment of connection in spaces deliberately ignored by those in power. By the time you leave the passage and merge back into the more formal areas of the estate, it becomes clear that love, though socially constrained, is resilient. The clever glances, hidden touches, and inventive exchanges in these overlooked corners reveal that human affection persists, bending circumstance and defying oversight, proving that even in the humblest corridors, the heart will find its clandestine voice. You drift into the dimly lit chapel at the heart of the estate, the scent of incense mingling with polished wood and cool stone. You probably won't survive noticing how love, in this hallowed, seemingly solemn space, still sneaks in through furtive glances and whispered prayers. In the 1700s, chapels weren't just for devotion, they doubled as arenas where propriety, superstition, and personal desire collided, giving room for fleeting moments of intimacy under the guise of piety. A young woman kneels at a pew, hands folded as if in quiet contemplation, while her eyes wander just enough to meet the gaze of a young man across the aisle. He pretends to recite prayers, though his attention is unmistakably elsewhere. Fringe historians have observed that chapels were subtly coded spaces. The choice of pew, the timing of genuflections, or the position of a kneeling posture could signal interest, a polite nod to human emotion woven into ritualized behavior. Historians still argue whether these silent signals were common or mainly anecdotal embellishments, yet their presence underscores the inventive ways affection navigates societal boundaries. Dowries, family reputation, and religious propriety linger like invisible candles over every step. You trudge through the tension as the pair exchanges subtle signs, a shared sigh at a long, solemn hymn, a gentle nod during the recitation of psalms, or a barely perceptible glance over shoulder at the other's posture. Even the act of passing a prayer book or lighting a candle becomes charged with meaning, as if ritual and romance are dancing in tandem beneath the vaulted ceilings. The sensory details enrich the clandestine encounter. The cool brush of stone floors beneath your feet, the faint echo of whispered prayers, the flickering of candlelight casting elongated shadows along the walls. You notice how a simple act, touching the same prayer book, brushing shoulders in passing, or sharing a suppressed smile, becomes a private, electric thread connecting hearts within the sanctity of formal devotion. By the time you leave the chapel, the duality of piety and desire is clear. Love, though risky and socially discouraged, persists through ingenuity, subtle gestures, and whispered exchanges. Even in spaces devoted to ritual, human hearts find expression, quietly negotiating boundaries and proving that intimacy can thrive amid solemnity and constraint. You wander into the bustling market square, where the earthy aroma of freshly baked bread mingles with the sharp tang of citrus and the faint metallic smell of coins exchanging hands. You probably won't survive noticing that even in this open, chaotic space, love continues its quiet rebellion against expectation. In the 1700s, public markets weren't merely hubs for commerce. They were arenas for fleeting encounters, coded exchanges, and social maneuvering, where glances and gestures carried weight far beyond the sale of goods. A young woman adjusts the folds of her shawl as she examines a display of ribbons, while her eyes repeatedly drift toward a young man negotiating for a basket of apples. He fumbles slightly with his coins, a deliberate act, some fringe historians claim, designed to draw attention without seeming overtly interested. Historians still argue whether these public flirtations were widespread or limited to the literate urban youth, but the stories that survive illustrate a human ingenuity that adapts to social boundaries. Dowries, parental scrutiny, and class divisions linger invisibly among the stalls. You trudge through the subtle choreography, a shared laugh at a vendor's exaggeration, a brush of hands when reaching for the same bundle of herbs, a fleeting exchange of words about a curious trinket. Even seemingly mundane interactions like passing a basket or adjusting a misaligned hat can serve as signals of interest, a silent communication that navigates the watchful eyes of onlookers. The sensory details are rich and enliven these encounters, the rough texture of woven baskets beneath fingertips, the crunch of straw underfoot, the chatter of merchants punctuated by the distant bray of a donkey. You notice how small, almost accidental touches, a hand brushing another while examining the same fabric, a shared smile over a dropped coin, a fleeting glance across the square, become moments of connection hidden in plain sight. By the time you leave the market, it's evident that love, though socially risky, is remarkably resilient. The clever maneuvers, stolen glances, and discreet touches in public spaces reveal that human affection finds expression everywhere, weaving through chaos, negotiating visibility, and thriving even amid scrutiny, proving that hearts will always seek connection wherever circumstance allows. You drift into the grand library where the scent of aged parchment, polished wood, and faint traces of candle smoke lingers like a memory. You probably won't survive noticing how even here, among towering shelves and hushed whispers, love finds sly ways to assert itself. In the 1700s, libraries were not only repositories of knowledge, they doubled as discreet arenas for social observation, flirtation, and intellectual signaling, where a shared book or an exchanged note could carry immense personal significance. A young man adjusts his spectacles, pretending to study a thick folio on natural philosophy, while his eyes sneak toward a young woman browsing a nearby shelf of poetry. Fringe historians have remarked that the careful placement of one's body, the choice of which tome to touch, or even the timing of a cough could communicate intention without a single word spoken. Historians still argue whether these subtleties were intentional courtship strategies or merely incidental, yet they reveal the ingenuity of the human heart in navigating rigid social norms. Dowries, familial expectations, and the weight of social propriety hover over each movement. You trudge through the tension as the pair maneuvers between the stacks, sharing a whispered remark about an obscure author, brushing fingers while turning a page, or a subtle nod acknowledging a joke. Even the act of offering to retrieve a book from a high shelf becomes laden with meaning, an unspoken promise of attentiveness and care. The sensory details amplify the intimacy, the rough texture of leather-bound volumes beneath fingertips, the faint creak of polished floorboards, the soft echo of whispered voices bouncing between tall shelves. You notice how a shared moment, a simultaneous pause to admire an illustration, a near touch while leaning over a desk, a brief glance across the reading tables becomes a thread of connection, weaving a private narrative within a public space. By the time you leave the library, it's clear that love, though constrained and cautious, persists through creativity and subtlety. The quiet exchanges, fleeting touches, and intellectual collaborations in these hallowed halls demonstrate that even amid formality, human hearts find ways to speak softly, persistently, and brilliantly. You step into the music room, where the scent of varnished wood and faint traces of beeswax polish mingle with the lingering resonance of a harpsichord's last notes. You probably won't survive noticing that love, even here, becomes a careful choreography of movement, melody, and attention. In the 1700s, musical instruction and evening recitals were not just cultural markers, they doubled as socially sanctioned opportunities for subtle courtship, where a lingering glance or a shared rhythm could convey more than words dared. A young woman traces her fingers along the edge of a piano, pretending to study the keys while her eyes continually drift toward a young man adjusting the music stand across the room. Fringe historians have suggested that the deliberate choice of piece, its tempo, its mood, even the positioning of sheet music, could serve as a coded language of affection. Historians still argue whether such musical signaling was widely understood or largely anecdotal, yet surviving letters hint at a persistent undercurrent of courtship embedded in these sessions. Dowries, propriety, and family surveillance still shape every gesture. You trudge through the tension as the pair exchanges subtle cues, a shared laugh at a missed note, a lightly brushed hand while turning a page, or an intentional pause to let the other's melody linger in the air. Even the act of offering to adjust a bench, tune a string, or reach for a misplaced quill can carry hidden weight, transforming mundane assistance into intimate communication. The sensory details heighten the clandestine exchange. The cool, polished wood beneath your fingertips, the soft resonance of strings vibrating through the floor, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows across the walls. You notice how a deliberate lean to hear better, a synchronized breathing pattern, or a nearly simultaneous strike of a key creates connection, weaving affection seamlessly into the structure of music and etiquette. By the time the last note fades, it's apparent that love, though constrained, persists in creativity, attention, and shared experience. The whispered gestures, fleeting touches, and nuanced collaboration reveal that even within disciplined forms like music, human hearts discover resonance, rhythm, and the subtle art of speaking softly without ever breaking the rules. You wander into the candlelit drawing room, where the mingling aromas of polished wood, wax, and faintly spiced tea invite a sense of quiet anticipation. You probably won't survive noticing how even in such formally arranged spaces, love manages to slip between the cracks of etiquette and expectation. In the 1700s, drawing rooms were not merely venues for polite conversation, they were stages for subtle signaling, clever observation, and the delicate navigation of desire beneath the ever-watchful eyes of chaperones. A young woman delicately adjusts the folds of her gown while feigning attention to a discussion about the latest fashion trends, her eyes darting just enough toward a young man who leans casually against the mantelpiece. Fringe historians suggest that the positioning of chairs, the choice of conversation topics, and even the direction of one's gaze could act as a silent language of courtship. Historians still argue whether these intricate behaviors were universally understood or confined to the social elite, but evidence from letters and diaries indicates their careful practice among those attempting to balance propriety with personal longing. Dowries, societal reputation, and parental oversight hover invisibly over every gesture. You trudge through the nuanced tension as the pair maneuvers across the room. A shared smile at an inside joke, a fleeting brush of hands while reaching for a teacup, a subtle tilt of the head, acknowledging interest. Even the act of passing a folded note, selecting a music sheet for performance, or adjusting the placement of a candle becomes imbued with intent and meaning. The sensory richness enhances these discreet exchanges, the smooth texture of embroidered fabric beneath your fingertips, the soft clink of porcelain cups, the low murmur of polite conversation punctuated by the occasional creak of floorboards. You notice how a gentle lean toward a shared portrait, a synchronized sigh at a familiar passage of poetry, or the carefully timed placement of a chair creates private threads of connection within the public sphere. By the time you leave the drawing room, it's evident that love, though constrained and fraught with social risk, persists through observation, subtle gestures, and ingenuity. The delicate glances, shared humor, and intricate choreography of movement reveal that even within highly regulated social spaces, human affection finds expression, quietly defying boundaries while remaining perfectly attuned to decorum. You slip into the dim glow of the evening garden, where the scent of night-blooming jasmine mingles with damp earth and the faint metallic tang of a nearby fountain. You probably won't survive noticing how love, even here, under the surveillance of the estate walls and the moon's soft gaze, finds daring ways to manifest. In the 1700s, gardens were not merely spaces of botanical display. They became arenas for subtle rebellion, whispered confessions, and the choreography of desire between the rows of hedges and the arches of trellises. A young man leans casually against a marble balustrade, pretending to admire the sculpted topiary while his eyes follow a young woman adjusting her shawl as she strolls along the gravel path. Fringe historians suggest that the choice of pathway, the timing of steps, and the deliberate pauses to admire a flower could carry implicit meaning, transforming a leisurely walk into a carefully staged performance of affection. Historians still argue whether such gestures were widespread social practice or primarily literary embellishments, yet the diaries and letters that survive hint at a highly coded language of romance. Dowries, family reputation, and the ever-present threat of gossip hover over every movement. You trudge through the subtle drama as the pair navigates winding paths and shadowed alcoves, a shared laugh at the misstep of a clumsy gardener, a barely perceptible touch of hands while adjusting a lantern, a whispered comment about a rare bloom. Even the act of offering to retrieve a fallen ribbon or leaning to examine the same delicate flower becomes an intimate exchange in a world that prizes discretion above all else. The sensory texture is vivid, the gravel crunching beneath your shoes, the cool breath of night air brushing against your skin, the subtle fragrance of flowers wafting through the arches of the garden. You notice how a glance toward the moon, a simultaneous pause to admire a fountain spray, or a nearly synchronized laugh creates an invisible thread of connection between two hearts navigating the maze of social expectation. By the time you leave the garden, it's clear that love, though cautious and constrained, thrives through cleverness, shared observation, and silent agreement. The hidden touches, timed gestures, and whispered comments demonstrate that even under the most watchful eyes, human hearts find ways to speak, to connect, and to persist in quiet triumph. You find yourself in the flickering candlelight of a quiet bedchamber, the faint scent of lavender and beeswax mingling with the lingering warmth of the day. You probably won't survive noticing how, even at the end of long social circuits, love manages to leave its subtle traces. In the 1700s, bedrooms weren't merely for sleep, they were private stages where letters were read, promises were whispered, and fleeting moments of affection could be claimed without the world watching. A young woman adjusts the curtains to let in the last slivers of twilight, while her companion lingers near a writing desk pretending to organize papers. Fringe historians have pointed out that the careful arrangement of objects, the deliberate selection of a quill, or even the timing of a letter being handed over could serve as discreet signals of connection. Historians still argue whether such private gestures were exceptional cases or everyday practice, yet the surviving correspondence suggests that intimacy often found its expression in the most mundane of actions. Dowries, family expectations, and societal propriety still hover over every movement, but within these walls they lose some of their power. You trudge through the intimate choreography as the pair navigates the room, a shared glance over an inkpot, a fleeting touch while adjusting the folds of fabric, a whispered remark about the day's events. Even the simple act of passing a candle from hand to hand carries weight, transforming ordinary utility into an opportunity for connection. The sensory details deepen the experience, the smooth grain of polished wood under fingertips, the faint crackle of a candle flame, the soft rustle of fabric as movements are mirrored in quiet synchrony. You notice how a simultaneous sigh, a gently shared smile, or the near alignment of hands while reaching for a book creates a subtle but undeniable intimacy. As you linger in this serene space, it becomes evident that love, though constrained, persists through clever gestures, attentiveness, and shared presence. The whispered exchanges, fleeting touches, and quiet observation reveal that even under strict societal norms, human hearts find ways to connect, express longing, and claim small victories in intimacy. Finally, as you close your eyes and feel the gentle hum of the evening settle around you, remember that the lessons of these quiet hearts, patience, subtlety, creativity, and courage linger beyond the pages and halls, offering warmth and reassurance to those who dare to love thoughtfully. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And now, as the night drifts softly over the estate, you feel the weight of centuries settling around you like a warm, woolen blanket. Each whispered glance, careful gesture, and subtle smile from the past seems to echo gently into your own present, reminding you that love, no matter how constrained or regulated, always finds a way to breathe. The halls grow silent, the markets empty, the harpsichords lie still, and even the fragrant gardens sleep, leaving only the quiet hum of possibility lingering in the air. You breathe slowly, in tune with the rhythm of candlelight flickers and the faint sigh of wind through latticed windows. The stories you've walked through, the coded glances in the chapel, the subtle touches in drawing rooms, the shared laughter in markets, the intimate exchange in private chambers, fade into a calm, soothing current. It's as if the centuries have softened, distilled into a gentle lullaby for your imagination. Allow the weight of decorum and the rigid rules of the 1700s to dissolve, leaving only the resilience of human hearts, persistent and tender. Feel the soft reassurance that even when society insists on boundaries, connection, ingenuity, and subtle courage find a way to flourish. Let your thoughts drift along the gravel paths, over the polished floors, and among the flickering candlelight, resting in the quiet knowledge that love has always and will always persist. As your eyelids grow heavier, let the gentle cadence of the day's stories carry you to rest. Relax, breathe, and let the soft echoes of history lull your mind, your body, and your heart into calm, sweet surrender.